Good to go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Albert. Hi, everyone. My name is Nora Medlin. I am a strategic technical leader in the Drupal space, and I go by the handle TechNora. Just to give you a little bit about my background, I have over 2 decades in the software development and technology world. I actually acquired a bachelor's in networking technology in 2006. Attended a master's in science, innovation and entrepreneurship program from 2013 to 2017. In the software development industry for over 2 decades, I think I would consider myself a language and platform agnostic at this point. And I also consider myself to be an analytics geek, where helping organizations through improving market share via strategic initiatives and process improvement. This talk here today, we're going to talk about maximizing project success and high-value partnerships. And as a servant leader, just one last note, I do attempt to achieve continuous learning through mentorship and facilitation, and part of that process is being here to do sessions with you here today. So thank you so much for having me. All right, so let's get started. Well, what I'm really more talking about is projects and getting started with projects. So every project starts somewhere. So let's get started. Now, at the very beginning of a project, and I think if we have other project managers in the room, you might relate to this, that getting that handoff from the sales department after the contracts is signed, or maybe even before, it's important to have that happen. So that internal sales handoff to either the team or project manager, or at least the director, we should make sure to include at least the contract terms and scope during that process. The fast follow for here might be you have a sales intro with the client where the PM is discussed and an overview of the project timeline and our steps are discussed. So maybe just a quick intro with that major stakeholder. That's all I have to say about that one. Now, I would say that, after you have that initial sales handoff, this is where you really get into your first initial significant communications with the client. You're going to have your kickoff workshop email where you're going to schedule your kickoff. And I usually advise using some booking facilitation like Calendly or MS Booking or something to that effect. You might also include an inclusion or accessibility statement. This one is important, especially with some agencies that are accessibility forward, where you may want to call out and just ask to make sure if your stakeholders have, especially if it's a new stakeholders, new account, that you have included, that question, so that if they need 5-minute breaks every 30 minutes, or if they need high contrast, whatever the case may be, they have the option to feel comfortable to let you know. Now, a similar email may be sent to a new stakeholder if you are transitioning to a new PM, just so you can think of it that way as well. This is also something useful there. I'm kind of interested to hear at this point from the audience, what do your initial communications look like internally and externally with your sales handoff and our initial kickoff emails? Anything different from what we were looking at before?
One thing I'll throw in there that I may have started doing, I've been utilizing like Google Docs or like a shared doc, even in my kickoffs, like whether that's the actual scope or like, hey, here's where the agenda is going to be. But I try to even start in the kickoffs to kick it off being collaborative. Like, this is a
Oh,
document. This is where we're
nice.
gonna,
Yeah.
maybe there's some questions there. Maybe there's an agenda for the project. So that could either be as part of that first, let's get this scheduled. Here's the
Uh-huh.
stuff that we'll talk about, or even the post, like, okay, once we've got it scheduled, maybe send that where it's like, here's where all the notes will be. Here's some points, maybe to link out to the scope so that we all have it in one place.
And maybe even a simpler, just a single, doc that they're going
Mm-hmm.
to be collaborating with, versus having to get all signed on to Jira or access to Jira or Confluence or something else going on. It's just a way to make it easy for them to start communicating, collaborating immediately. That's really
Exactly.
great.
Yeah, but
Anybody
then
have any other? I'm sorry, go ahead,
I was just
Albert.
gonna say, yeah, and then once you start doing the onboarding, or you have even in that doc creating checklists, hey, we need this from you. And then the link, when we do get to Jira, the link will be there, but then that also establishes like a central place to come back to.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, no, I love it. I like that idea. I don't know if I don't have the full participant list here, but I see Andrea. Maybe I don't know if you have anything to add here. Just give anybody else. And there's Kristen.
It's
Okay.
called Project Kickoff.
Yeah, project kickoff. Yeah. Any sort of initial communications that you might do. What I was suggesting here was, you have your internal sales handoff, and then you also might have your email that's going to be that initial kickoff. Albert was talking about a collaboration doc. Do you do anything else, Andrea?
Yeah, no, that's all I was gonna say, the same as kind of like a collaboration doc, just pretty much for expectations. The thing is, we
Mhm.
don't always do it, and that's when we get in trouble, right?
Right, right. If you don't set the tone right away, right, with
Yes,
that collaboration requirement.
exactly.
So I agree. Yeah, yeah. Having those standards, it's definitely something to work on with your process improvement team. Okay, next item here, I will say, getting into the actual kickoff. So this, will provide early alignment and setting that tone we were talking about. It provides, the business and client teams to build rapport with each other, including, again, any inclusion state things that need to be known, and just that transparency we're talking about, those documents as well. Many agencies, I think, I've been around the block a few times. So many agencies are great at getting contracts signed and later implementing. However, the in between seems like there's a lot of times where there's delays as the team is being built, which can cause overruns and affect meeting initial and final milestones. And just to, add to that it's important to have a good idea of how to get resources lined up and kick off as soon as possible. The producers and production manager, like your resourcing manager, therefore should build and be involved with building and updating processes and templates around these initial and critical stages, just so that you can, really be prepared to kick off really quickly with any templating that you might need as well. But really, it's just about, getting that happening here, fairly quickly. So in the kickoff workshop, the client-facing kickoff workshop, the purpose here is to align with the goals and communication plan and timeline. That's really kind of the major points that I would suggest making sure to cover during your client-facing kickoff. Your agenda items, again, should include other things, potentially, such as team member introductions, especially if they're a new client or you have new team members on either side. You can include an icebreaker activity, though it's not required. I think that sometimes in larger environments or more informal stakeholder environments, it might not be as advantageous to do icebreaker activity. But if you can squeeze it in, I think it might kind of break down some walls to do that as well. And asking something different than just like, what's your favorite, oh, I don't know, flavor of coffee? You probably want to ask something else like that's going to cause a discussion to happen, like, what's your favorite movie? Or what do you do on a Saturday night? That sort of thing. You might ask those questions. And then another item you might want to ask is or make sure to cover, excuse me, is just generally that you're looking to get what you're looking to get out of the project, your primary focus. So, this sort of mission charter, sort of idea here about the project. One potential challenge that you might have with your initial kickoff that I have noticed is, especially if you have a lot of stakeholders on that call, there may be some internal politics or opposing goals happening that may prevent all the client members from being completely forthright during this kickoff workshop. So it might not be a great idea to ask a whole lot of questions and try to do any sort of, actual stakeholder interview type things or anything like that during this initial kickoff, but rather it's just about focusing and aligning on those goals of the project. Though I would say that I have seen also, if this is done well, or there's been opportunities for this where The client team members, it may have been their very first time to meet with each other. There you have maybe universities, for instance, where you have certain campuses that are not always talking to the central office, but they are involved with this thing that they're building with you on this project. And they, will be able to develop those relationships through the course of the project, and it will benefit their company organization, long term. I think that could be a really good success point. One other thing to mention is that you might also include a discussion around meeting cadence here, if it's not already covered previously, but hopefully, you might have already had that conversation with the initial conversation with the client and or the initial emails. So, again, based on your audience, you may not necessarily need everybody in the room for that piece. So I would setting that as optional. Now, for the internal kickoff, also known as your rah-rah, you have your internal team members, including any non-client facing team members. So not just your leads. We're talking about everybody on the internal side is getting together and really getting in alignment with that project. You want to make sure to cover things like introductions. That happens a lot in agency. You'd be surprised how many times a team member hasn't happened to work with another team member on an agency, and an agency. And so you might want to go through the introductions. The other part that I found really helpful here is that, especially for junior team members, getting them comfortable with just introducing themselves consistently every single time that they're doing a new thing gets them more comfortable with doing it in front of clients or doing it at events. And, it helps to build their, that ability to be able to sell themselves and or be a representative of the company as well. So introductions there. And then you also might want to include things like the client overview, what the client is about, what their mission and goals are, that sort of thing, who the contacts are in general. But you want to cover more or less what's on that contract. So what the timeline and scope are, things like that. You also probably want to include some initial onboarding items, simple things like the links to the project resources on Jira or Confluence, like the website URL for their existing website if you're doing a rebuild or something like that. Having these things captured and documented and centralized really early on is essential. I don't know how many times I've had a situation where if somebody comes after a kickoff and is like, where is that information? And if you don't have it like in an easy place for them, they might be, asking again. So that might be good to do. On another topic you might want to cover is just aligning on roles and meeting cadence. So it's not talking about with the client here. We're talking about in the internal meetings, especially if you're running on an agile methodology. You're going to want to be clear about how often, the frequency, which days, which times, especially if you have your team members working on multiple projects. You might decide to have some, this project be worked on towards the second half of the week or the first half of the week or vice versa, or something to that effect as well. So let's, make sure that we're clear on all our roles. And, a lot of people might ask, like, why would you need to know about the roles? Isn't that defined by your title? Well, not always. I think in general, you have a lot of times where a lead will be a lead on 2 or 3 projects, but not on others. And you will have, other team members that specialize in certain things that, will work on one thing versus another on different projects. So just making sure that everybody's in understanding of what those roles are. Now, you may not know what their roles are until you are at this meeting, because you might have just a team that's thrown together. So you could discuss them. You could take the agile sort of resourcing methodology there and say, what does everybody feel passionate about now that we're thinking about this project? And let's think about what roles you think you might play. But let's make sure to define those so that we're clear about who goes and does what. And then you also want to define next steps. And this is something that I might mention a few more times here, but I have found great success in this focus on next. So it's not only about looking back and seeing what's going on previously and being able to improve upon that during a retro, for instance, but Really, it's important to define those next steps immediately here after the initial kickoff so they have something actionable that they can run with after that call. So even if it's just something simple, like get your local set up, whatever it is. And then you want to also identify through this discussion if there's any additional resourcing needs. And it should come up, here pretty quickly. You might not know, of course, until later, but if you can, and you can, reach out to your resourcing person as immediately as possible, then the better. Optionally, and depending upon the size and complexity, there might be a separate, the raw sort of like an icebreaker meeting. So if you have, large project team where it's, potentially separate sub teams or matrixed environment, that sort of celebratory aspect and getting the team members to really to get to know each other might happen in a separate meeting. Just wanted to make a note there. So after you get your kickoff, it is really, again, it's easy to lose steam. There's like these points where, you might get all the information as a team member, as a team, and you're like, okay, well, I don't know, this feels really big. So I'm not sure I'm ready to wrap my head around it yet. But really just focusing on that next is important here. And one way to do that from the project management side is you might do things like build a RACI chart. So during that initial kickoff with a client, you might get some of this information to be able to build an idea of, who is involved and how involved should they be throughout the actual project or informed throughout the actual project. If you'd like, you can take a screenshot of this QR code here and download or view that Miro template that you can use for RACI chart. But more or less, the idea here is that you can identify with the RACI chart, which people should be contacted and how frequently. The x-axis on the left there is to do with influence. So if the user is more influential within their company, they would appear towards the top, less they're towards the bottom. On the x-axis, we have interest and availability, meaning, there's less interest and or availability towards the left and more towards the right. And depending upon what quadrant they kind of fall in, you would have like a CDO in this example that you would want to keep satisfied. And the main contact would be actively engaged. Whereas decision makers that aren't always around for every client status meeting, you would just want to keep informed. So that's the idea here with this RACI chart, is to help you with that. Let me just make sure I covered everything here. I'm trying to make sure I don't run out of time as well. So I apologize if I'm rattling on about this. But I would say that you don't need to make a formal graphic like this. It can be helpful, though, and especially in case you need someone else to cover for you. It could be a quick way for them to see, what that structure is, who should they be contacting, that sort of thing. But I've also found that it's easily enough translated into a table on a Confluence page or something like that, or on a doc, where you list out the stakeholders and what things that they are involved with specifically. So it may be a certain portion of the company or a certain feature on the website. That sort of thing might be all you need in order to effectively do this same thing. One quick story about this I did have is a situation where a point of contact was an extreme subject matter expert. They were someone who triaged support tickets from end users daily and asked for frequent updates in Slack about a list of tickets. The actual decision maker on the project is not technical at all. They only cared about which updates related to their marketing department holistically, and they cringed if we mentioned a Jira ticket number or estimates or anything like that. So you can see just by the different kinds of people that you might have involved or stakeholders involved is where they might fall in that communication plan or strategy with the client. This is just talking about like, what does that next steps email look like after kickoff to the client? We're talking about, setting up those expectations around, what was covered, not only like a summary of what was covered, a recap, but also really it's all about that next and making sure that they're clear on those expectations. You might also include a high-level timeline. I found graphic representations of timeline to be very valuable. I've even found it's a little bit more like time consuming, I guess, but you could just use a spreadsheet and color the boxes, things like that. So you don't necessarily have to use an expensive tool like Jira to provide timeline information, but having some sort of graphic, or Canva, you could even use Canva, to build a timeline graphic would be good to provide to your client in order to provide that clarity around expectations there. This is really the meat of my talk here, and let me check on our time at this point. I'm almost halfway through, or more than halfway through, I think, at this point. So
we're 24.
yeah. So I will say that this portion of my talk has a lot to do with this idea of a discovery first approach. I'm going to kind of fly through this a little bit, but it's really the end where we're going to have discussion that I think people will be interested to collaborate and talk about it. So the idea here, the proposition here, and you've probably already seen this a lot of times, is that that projects can easily suffer from a cart before the horse type syndrome. And you end up inadvertently subjecting clients to a smoke and mirrors sort of phase of the project where their meeting frequency is high and they have little substantive output, meaning, that not a whole lot seems to be getting done. But to avoid this pitfall, it's important to have those clear set of criteria around the project goals, and it helps to bridge the gap between research, strategy, and implementation. I will say that this is like the two-part example. So a world without a discovery first approach, you would have your proposal and sign off that would happen at first. You would have your design and POC that would start to happen, where you're starting to see if you could accomplish that goal like you think you could with that contract. But you might find out during the design that, oh, we need more money. So we are going to ask for a change order. Oh my goodness. Okay, let's ask for more money. So we ask for more money and then we continue with the design and POC. Hopefully we don't have to ask for money again until we actually build and or launch the product. But oftentimes we actually see that during build, there will be things that we'll discover as well. And we might have to ask for more money again. Now, the answer might be no in all these cases, which that could be a really large risk for a lot of agencies and clients. Has anybody ever experienced this before in general? I mean, I'm sure everybody has, right? Never. Perfect all the time. Okay. Anybody have a story that they wanted to share specifically?
Can you go back to the last slide that
Sure.
by so fast?
Anything to ask about this one, or?
Yeah, I think it happens a lot where, you start building and you don't really get a change order. I think sometimes what happens is you get a little too far finished to the finished
Mhm.
product, and then somebody wants to change it, right? And then it's almost too late.
Right. Yeah, that's even the worst, like, sort of scenario.
Yeah, you either live with it or,
Or you bite the bullet and take eat the cost and get it done, and hopefully you don't have to hire a bunch of resources to do it, right?
Yeah, right.
I think it's similar to sometimes too when somebody's came in from the beginning. You know how when you ask for feedback, I know that it just reminds me of like you're in a project, the stakeholder has said, they looked at the top of it. Oh, that's great. Let's keep going. And then when you're like, hey, you've been asking for a review, you're getting close to a deadline. And then they finally dig into it, and it's like, oh, we need to change this, or like that's not exactly what I said from the
Mhm.
beginning.
Yeah.
Which then puts
Misalignment there.
then it puts everybody in a bad situation of like, now it's a blaming game of like, well, we heard it this way, you thought it was that way. The person who was managing the project and
Yeah.
their the contact wasn't involved, didn't communicate with the
Sure.
stakeholder. So I think that upfront work, I've always seen, the more you can discuss, discover, and then I think even document like this is what we're trying to do and this is what we
Sure.
agree upon, the better. Like you said, really doing
You
that
have
discovery first.
given me my exact transition into the next. So, in a world with a discovery first approach, this might look a little different. You might do things like intentionally build your billing to your client out to be a phased approach. So the idea is that you have separate contracts. There's going to be an initial phase that's going to be for discovery, things like requirements and envisioning. It would be a completely separate agreement. There's actual deliverables. A selling point for this is that they could take this stuff that they get, including possibly designs. I've had that happen before, and go somewhere else to build it. You got your money, you still got your, sort of value out of it on the agency side as well. But so did the client. It's a mutual sort of conference. Yes, phased approach is key. Thank you so much, Albert. And so I would say that this discovery, is really just part of getting all the nuts and bolts in order to outline those objectives in development, for development, and identify a roadmap for implementation. Having those objectives helps you to control the scope creep. The audience and scope creep may be different or bigger than you originally understood, like you were talking about, Albert. And earnings, I would point this out too, that honestly, your earnings might end up at the end of the whole thing much larger because your scope ends up being more well understood, and it's more easily in bites, because it's not a huge thing that they're going to have to feel like they have to wrap their head around that they're paying for. Now, I would say that some clients will require still for you to say, in contract, how much the thing entirely is going to cost. I would suggest trying a budget range approach here so that you can provide them with at least the highest dollar amount that they would need to secure with their internal accounting in order to be successful with the project. But more or less the goals here is to increase velocity and interest. And let me show you here. So you have your sort of agile. This is kind of like in the sense of, a waterfall versus agile, but really taking it farther with a phased approach and being more intentional with, having those deliverables in contract with each particular phase. So we're just talking about building in an agile way also during that requirements and envisioning phase. And then you're going to deploy and roll out potentially if it's something that it would make sense to do for, let's say, a POC or something like that. I would say that where this kind of comes from and gives you a bigger picture about this is the idea of breaking it up into phases. It's easier to swallow each of these chunks that you're delivering on. There's this diagram that I came across and recolored for that purpose and decided to, put in some information here. But you can think of it kind of like a nesting doll situation where, you have this initial needs that you're going to be capturing, maybe a POC and a prototype. It will help to inform that technical approach. And again, that will help to inform design and then implementation, testing, launch. And then you could potentially break it up into different phases there. At the bottom, you'll see requirements, envisioning, build, deployment, and rollout. So just to give you an idea here a little bit more about the agile side of things, that during each phase, you may contain multiple deliverables. You could represent these as epics in your Jira or otherwise tracking tool. And, using that agile approach, your stories and tasks for each deliverable should be placed in implemented over several sprints, just like any other agile type of project that you might have. So really treat them as like separate little projects. And even during an earlier phase where more ideation is happening, it's a good idea to manage work within sprints. You might not think that it's going to be valuable to do sprinting during a design phase, for instance, or a requirements phase, for instance, but still having those, the review, feedback, user acceptance, demo, retro sort of activities can actually be really helpful for the team and for the client to show that you are delivering something of value for them. Without sort of doing this, you might have this sort of throwing over the wall from design to dev situation. just basically because people aren't really all in the same room. So what I'm saying here is that you probably still want your dev lead in the room, even if you're just doing design, just so that they can see what's happening, what the ideas are, say, hold, wait, we can't do that from a technical perspective, or let's explore that a little bit more before we promise, that sort of thing. Has anyone experienced a multi-phase? It sounds like, Albert, you might have.
Yeah, I think even I definitely think the phased approach, like when I worked at agencies, we real big long projects that we may be doing agile, even the scope of work or the engagement was quarterly. And then I was a technical project manager. And so even in working with the client, those quarterly engagements helped give me a guide as well. And then I was able to um like, okay, in the first quarter, maybe when the first project kicked off, we knew where we were trying to get to over a year and a half. But instead of saying, and we gave an estimate of like, this is how much it'll probably cost, but let's just break it down based on team need and like per quarter. And so then after the first quarter as a PM, I could help our sales side of like, here's what I'm hearing is going to come up and we need to really focus on in this next quarter. Let's, that we can put that as the deliverable for the quarter. So
Sure.
we all kind of
Yeah.
had a way to gauge. And I think that left the client more satisfied, where it's like we're not committed to the long run. And then we had team members leave off the project during the project. And the quarterly approach definitely helped because then, okay, we
Yeah.
knew there was a certain type of feature coming up in the roadmap for a particular quarter, and we can adjust to kind of make sure we had the proper resources.
Yeah.
Or like we brought
Yeah.
swapped out a team member, maybe early we
You
needed
make a great
design.
point. I think I
Now
even
we're gonna
had it
go.
on my notes here that, yeah, the sort of another advantage somewhere in there. I do apologize. I was going back and forth there. Is you can swap out team members. And I think that resource sharing is going to happen at your
Mhm.
agency across projects anyway, right? And there might be different reasons for that swap. It might be burnout, it might
Yep.
be passion, it might be, that they just are needed more on somewhere else, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off, but
no
I do
worries,
want to
no
get
worries.
through a
Yeah,
couple
get
other
get through. Yeah,
things.
get through yours, please, please feel free.
There was, I think I saw Kristen said, yes, but some clients don't want to pay for a separate discovery. With those clients, I would say that, still try to like contractually give them a dollar amount that they need to secure for in order to deliver the entire thing. But breaking it up, like Albert was talking about, into phases, even if it's just a milestone perspective,
Mhm.
I think that will help to provide that sort of continued trust and value that you are, having with your client. So I appreciate that. Now, this is more internal team stuff. I don't know if I have really any time. No, I do still have time. Hey, I got through that. I'm glad I have time for this. So I did want to talk a little bit about, how it works with your internal team and avoiding burnout. A phased project approach really helps with this, I think, too. And it's typical of agile projects to, I think, do this as well, as what I'm hearing a lot. But it not only breaks down the work into chunks into those easily to swallow, but also allows you to, again, work on those parts to be delivered individually and then, towards the entire project. So let's talk a little bit about internal communication on helping to avoid that burnout. You want to focus on providing, valuable touch points, I think, is really how you kind of think about it with your internal teams. There are a lot of situations where resources will say, I'm on too many meetings, I can't get anything done, right? So I think it's going to depend upon that particular project and that particular team or team dynamics on exactly, what that will look like. But so you're going to want to make sure to, discuss and figure out what that frequency and saturation of your meetings are. And it might even include, your discussion about how much that sprint, how long those sprints should be. And it might even change. I've had situations where we think it's going to be make sense to have a 2-week times a sprint. But maybe during this particular phase, we actually want to close out and demo and provide value on a weekly basis or a 3-week basis. So be flexible with that, and have your retros at each of those sprint endpoints so that you can adjust your sprinting if necessary there across the phase. But I would say that during your sprinting, I'm sure a lot of people are informed here as far as what sprinting is and agile, but you do want to go through and triage your tickets with scrubbing, provide estimation, place them from the backlog into the actual plan for that sprint. Do things like activities like your stand-ups. And this is, again, your frequency decisions will determine when your stand-ups will happen. It might be in the morning, it might be in the afternoon, it might be only Monday, Tuesday. It just really depends upon the needs of that project and that team. But regular stand-ups in general. You want to do your demos. You also want to do your retrospectives. I've actually found cases where agencies aren't in the habit of doing a retrospective or a demo. They do everything else, just not those two parts. And that's almost the worst, to be honest, because if you never reflect on how well you did and how you can improve, you're probably never going to really get more, faster, quicker velocity towards the end of the project. You might even drag it out really far, and people are not able to voice their concerns, for instance. And so you're just not getting things taken care of that might be actual blockers down the road. Maybe not immediately, but down the road. So your demos, I'm not talking about internal demos here in this particular case. You, of course, always want to try to client demo if you can, but really internal demoing, I think prior to that, a client demo is really valuable here as well. Risks, if you neglect them, you just will suffer the quality and delivery. And, I think also it's important to have these things because on your contracts, you really should be targeting like a 25% of the implementation in QA for these activities. And if you can, justify that through your delivery cycles with the client and providing that value, they should really be able to pay you for these internal admin meetings that are happening. You should be able to contract for that. I know I've heard some people say, well, we don't want to do it because we didn't charge the client for that. Why not? Do it. I don't understand why not. So let me move on to a couple other things. But again, I think there's this whole thing around focus on next, and that will really help your team drive forward to the next item and not dwell too much. I mean, at the end of the day, even after a retrospective or during a retrospective, it's really important to have something actionable that you're taking out of that and bringing into the next sprint. Anything different that you might do as far as your communication plan or internally, or does that seem in alignment with what everybody else does? Anything to add here? No, I'm hearing a lot of silence. Okay, well, then everybody's doing it great. So we don't need to talk about that one. So there's maybe, oh, go ahead. Oh, you said 4 minutes? Gotcha.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
So last part here that I'll talk about real quickly is just in order to increase the sort of getting in the flow situation, there's going to be a lot of times where you're going to have, again, team members working on separate projects, many different projects. There's going to be a context switching sort of situation here. You might suggest and mentor your team members on how to best plan their time and deal with things like the project organization on your end as well, just to make sure that you have everything, outlined so that it's easy for people to understand. Let me get back to that here real quick. So what I'm talking about is your skeleton of your project, your sort of products and features level at the top, maybe your epics, and then you have your stories, tasks, and bugs. And depending upon the complexity of the project is how many levels of this you actually need. You could utilize tagging on your tickets, or something like a needs discussion, or that it has components of a specific type. You might have due dates, and you probably want to limit those to hard deadlines and not cloud the whole queue with all the due dates that you don't want to manage anyway. But if you do have a hard deadline on an item, maybe it's a prerequisite for something else, you want to probably call that out. Swim lanes on your board, you want to maybe categorize it or group it by, or I'm sorry, create a board per audience and then group, let's say, your internal board by assignee, so that when you're running through those stand-ups, it'll be pretty easy for them to go through their stand-up, versus when you're talking with a client, it might look like a epic level organization. There's also dashboarding, release tracking, other things that you can do. Your overview page with your Confluence or Docs, as far as, having information in a centralized location. Now getting into your personal, like, sort of browser tab organization. I think this is just to know that browsers have grouping and labels and color coding and save for later. These things are in your browsers. I've seen a lot of times where people have a million tabs open all the time, and you don't need to. You could just group it, save it, look at it later, put it in a bookmark type thing or something, so that you're increasing your focus there. You also might want to take a look at integrations that might help you. This might include things like email to Slack, so that you send an email directly into a Slack message, or email to Jira to create a ticket, or Slack to Jira to create a ticket from Slack. Things like time tracking tools inside maybe Jira, and I use Jira a lot, that's why I mentioned it so much, but there's things like add-ons like Tempo that will make things easier for time tracking right within your tool, and you might have others like Harvest with Asana, that sort of thing that you could do as well. Just make it easier for people to try to do all the things in more centralized location is the idea here. And you might also have some other integrations like Jira meeting notes on the calendar. There's things that are available to do with that. Or even making sure that there's a synchronization between Jira and your calendar, exposing that on your Google Calendar. That could be helpful as well. There's an item to do with status automations that I thought I would just quickly mention as well. It has to do with, where you can update the status on your Slack or your Zoom based off of your calendar. There's a couple different tools that I've utilized before, Reclaim AI and Don't Interrupt app. And these will all be on the slides for you to download off the website if you wanted to take a look at that. Just generally though, I think it's a good tactic to think inbox zero or some other similar strategy where you are deciding initially if you need to respond or just remind yourself to deal with it later. That will save you probably the most time and make you most efficient. And using these methodologies, I think coaching your teams even on doing that, it will help them to increase that flow and get them through their tasks that they need to accomplish within a particular day or week. Any other tips and tools that anybody wants to add for increasing flow? All right. So I will say I added this today, so it may be a little bit more animation than I absolutely needed, but I'm looking for something new. Hire me. Here's my resume. Take a screenshot, share it. Do whatever you want with it. Contact me. I'm available on LinkedIn. I have my links all over and email all over. I definitely would, enjoy speaking with someone if they have an opportunity available in project management, and see what I can do for you or any of your contacts. So I appreciate that. Tempo and Google Calendar integration. Yes, thank you, Kristen. That is another awesome integration that you can use as well. The only last thing to mention is I do have a group as well on LinkedIn and a Slack called Digital Career Sandbox. I've just recently last year started creating and building and growing this year as well. This is a space where, and also just read this off real quick, where tech and creativity collide and redefine the rules of professional growth. Picture a vibrant playground where digital dynamos and tech wizards come to play, innovate, and sculpt their career paths from coding and design, strategy and product development. We're all about building a community where experimentation is the norm and leaning in is as exciting as uncovering hidden Easter eggs. So whether you're a coding connoisseur or a design diva, join us as we craft the future of work one pixel at a time. 1 pixel and line of code at a time. I messed it up right there at the end. But the idea here is that I created a community that I think helps to support a lot of people that are going through economic downturn type stuff. And I'm one of those. So I built it for that purpose. But thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope that this has been valuable to you. I hope you had a great camp and great rest of your day and weekend. Any other questions before we end?
I just want to say thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Emily. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Albert. If you wanted to stop the recording at this point.